I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. Season 12 has been going amazingly, and I hope you've been enjoying. Today we have an extremely special guest, John Willinsky. He is an educator, researcher, and leading advocate for open access to scholarly knowledge. He is a Khosla Family Professor Emeritus at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, with a career spanning decades in education, literacy, publishing, and technology. His early academic work explored the educational implications of systems such as literary theory, curriculum theory, lexicography, and European imperialism, before evolving into a focus on how scholarly research and knowledge can be opened up and shared as a public resource for education and civic deliberation. He founded the Public Knowledge Project, PKP, in 1998, a research and software initiative devoted to making scholarly publishing more accessible and equitable. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Gotham. Good to meet you and good to be part of this.
Yeah, I mean, it was so fun reading up on a lot of your work, and I've never heard of the terms literary theory and curriculum theory, but I've been around it. I know what it is, but it's been so interesting to kind of see that in a technical form. And I always love hearing people's origin stories. But what kind of sparked your original interest in both of those fields?
Well, I was kind of a nerdish high school student and a young person, so books were my thing, and literature in particular. So I had a love of literature well before I knew what literary theory was either. And in thinking about how I wanted to share that with others, how I wanted to become a teacher, and to work with literature in classrooms, I realized that there were ideas about it, that there were theories, and that this enthusiasm for literature wasn't just an innate love of it. There was actually ideas. Why is this good? What is it about literature that gets you excited? And why is it so important in the schools? I mean, we study literature almost every year that we're in elementary and high school. Uh, and so I became curious about that. And part of that was once I started teaching, I realized not everyone shared my enthusiasm. Hard to believe I was that naive, but that I could see that there was a spark in some students and others weren't as enthusiastic, didn't quite get what I was so excited about in literature. And so I began to realize that it wasn't this natural thing that everybody should love. It came out of a theory, an idea about what's good about it. And that led me to understand, or at least to explore more, what are the ideas behind education? How is it is conceived in a way that is so important that it's compulsory, so important that we dedicate decades of young people's lives to it? And what were we trying to do? It wasn't just spark a love of literature. There was more to this, especially because some kids resisted and some kids were not impressed, as it were, by that concept. So the literary theory that probably matters the most in the schools, in terms of the whole history of teaching literature, is Matthew Arnold. Is a Victorian poet of great renown. Dover Beach was one of the great poems of my high school days, the ignorant armies clashing by night. Um, and Matthew Arnold was an inspector of schools. He was an educator. So interesting combination. And he felt and he argued, this is in the late 1800s, that literature formed the soul. We need to expose kids to literature to form their soul and their character. And this is just the early days of mass schooling. Wasn't even compulsory, but it was certainly mass, when children were being taken out of factories and being schooled, very Dickensian kind of period. And so this idea that literature could be counted on to form the soul and character of the young kind of caught me. Like, was I on some kind of mission? Was I the soul former, and was that the basis of my enthusiasm? And it was also a time of great British imperialism. And so that spirit of literature was being spread around the empire. Um, and English was being taught. India is a very good example of where that took root, but also in North America and other places, in Australia. It was being used to civilize and was part of an imperial mission. And when I started to realize that, I really began to question some of my values and some of what I took for granted as a school teacher. Was I part of this mission in some way? I'd been, as a youth, in the protest days against the war in Vietnam in the 70s, 60s and 70s. I had seen myself as um, part of that resistance, part of the counterculture. And I had to really rethink my role as a teacher. Where was I? What had happened to me in the classroom? So that brought me in face to face with literary theory. I looked at feminist literary theory as a kind of countermeasure to see how literature could be a source of resistance. I looked at other forms of approaches to literature that were more direct, to kind of a more personal response to literature as being a better way of approaching it. So I was searching in that form. Um, and this is all part of curriculum theory, too. Curriculum theory is just what is it we should be teaching? What is important enough to teach kids? That's the theory.
What an
What
interesting question, huh?
Yeah, well, and it's not one that's easily answered.
Yeah.
So it is one we're still wrestling with. Sometimes it's about science versus the humanities. Sometimes it's about moral values and civic values. So that is the responsibility. And I was a teacher educator by that point. I had gone back to school. I was a university dropout when I started teaching. And I went back to school. And in the course of my teaching career, I went right to the PhD and became a professor. And at that point, I was given the responsibility of doing research and scholarship. I mean, not just the responsibility, but enthusiasm for it, really, to look into the sources of these ideas about education. Uh,
Wow.
and that at that point, this critical aspect, including Matthew Arnold, I also did work on the Oxford English Dictionary, on where dictionaries came from and where was the authority there? What were we doing with language in the classroom? When I started teaching, there was a Bible, a New Testament, mind you, in every kid's desk. And when I finished teaching, that's in the beginning of the 70s. When I stopped teaching in the 80s, early 80s, there was a dictionary in every student's desk and no Bible. Uh, and so the dictionary had taken on a kind of authority that I hadn't really understood as a teacher. Where do the definitions come from? How is that decided when a word fits in the dictionary and when it doesn't? So those are the kind of driving questions that led my research.
I
And
mean,
yeah, go ahead.
no, keep going. Sorry.
No, I can lead on. I'm giving you a chance to jump in because I can obviously go on. But I think that's that first phase of my life in terms as a teacher, coming out of this love of literature and the protest culture of the 60s and 70s, running into this contradiction.
Hmm.
Um,
I love listening to a good story, so I feel like I could hear you. And you're a good orator, so I'm like I could don't stop me. I could keep listening. But I want to just touch on literary theory a little bit more, especially on
okay.
what you're sharing here with your early career, because I feel like my life really changed when I had a similar kind of revelation with math, though. And until I think I was 20, until then, math was always something that I despised. I found it boring. It felt so regurgitative in a lot of way. And I was like, I don't understand this. And then I came across my first abstract math class in college, and it opened up a whole new world to me that was about understanding, about finding this like logical form in the universe. And it was, I mean, it made me understand how magical math is. And it kind of connected the creativity, the art. I learned about the history of it. How did we inherit what we have today? It became an entire process of falling in love with the world that was no longer just numbers on a page. It became the history of the number zero is so magical. And it's something that it is a concept that took thousands and thousands of years for the human mind to even understand and then explain and then put it down into notation and then for it to spread slowly around the world. I mean, it's phenomenal. And every part of math has been so transformative but it can feel when you wake up that it just looks like what it is and okay, done. And I think that it took me a little while later, maybe 2 or 3 years after that, to fall in love with literature for the same reason. Every word has such a long history to get to where it is today, to get to what it means today, the way that it's used. Language isn't some static object. It's this constantly evolving thing that you relate to and it relates to you. You can change it and it can change you. It's not some fixed thing that it's not a rock, And I think
Mm.
when I started to understand that these were all like constructed things that I don't that are so magical, it completely changed how I read books, how I read poetry, everything. But the reason I'm so fascinated by that is I don't know why it took so long to get to a point where I was around people who talked about it like that, or I was around people who even spoke about English like that or language like that. Until then, it was all about grammar, rules, structure. The focus was so much on I don't know. I don't know what the word is, but it wasn't on developing a sense of awe or wonder, but it was about like getting it. Can you get it right? And it
Hmm.
felt like the emphasis was so much on getting it right that it completely sucked any awe and wonder out of it. And I want to just connect that both because I think that connects to literary theory and um, curriculum theory. But I really like that poem that you said of like, or that quote you said of literature was used to kind of form the soul. Can you expand a little bit more about at its highest form, what do you think the power of literature can be?
But I want to check your enthusiasm a little bit, Gautam. I want to suggest to you that I too started with the wonder and particularly the rapture around literature, enthusiasm, and then uh, that wonder was cut with the political, with the sense of a project, that it's a human construction. It's not a wonder and Matthew Arnold did give it a spiritual plane, a sense of transcendence that you can, you're beyond the world. And again, coming out of a background, a period of counterculture, there was that question about in whose interests. Um, and math is a pure, remote, abstract, glorious form of reason and logic. But it's also got a history of Hindi numbers and the Chinese concept of zero and the Islamic empire spread of power and of mathematics.
Yeah.
And so there's that extra aspect, and education is never going to be free of that political or that dominance or that power, that global force. Um, and I think what we discover is we have moments where the classroom disappears, where it's just you and the words on the page. But that's a moment, because then you look up and you realize, oh my God, I can't leave till 4 o'clock, or oh my God, I'm behind. I'm in the wrong classroom or something. So I think that's the element that I've gone back and forth around, because I did think of my soul and my character formed by the books and the reading that I was doing. But the innocence of that and the purity of that wasn't corrupted so much. It was just that I could see behind the scenes. It wasn't puppets with strings or anything, but there was a sense in whose interests. Um, how is this being formed? In literature, when you think of James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or more contemporary figures, you can think of them as independent and free of any kind of political persuasion and pure in their art. But then you think about how that those works are used to inspire a respect for British literature, with all the irony of Joyce being Irish. And you can see how that is used to form a sense of class sensibility, literary sensibility as a class element. And I
Mm.
ran into that very directly in my classrooms when I saw the resistance to it. So
Wow.
I want those moments of rapture, as you mentioned, in terms of math or in terms of literature. But I don't want to be, I don't want to lose sight of the situation
The
of
context.
the,
Yeah.
yes, we're in a school where
Yeah.
there is
I mean,
compulsory attendance.
mm. And I guess I was thinking about your relationship to literature also outside of school. I mean, just the way you read in your day to day, or, and I think though, but I was going to ask you in terms of even when you were a teacher, what was the relationship between how the books that are read are chosen? And did you kind of address that in the classroom too? Because I feel like I never really had that space where we read a book because it was quote unquote good, but we never really explored why are we reading 1984? Why are we reading Fahrenheit
Yeah,
451, you know?
no, I know. It's so that is a very interesting aspect. I saw myself as a rebellious teacher. Let me give you a Bay Area example that Richard Brautigan, Trout Fishing in America. I would bring in this kind of subversive 60s literature into my classroom. I would have the kids, in fact, one of the ironies for me is when students, public school students who I had when they were 10 or 12, will write me 30 or 40 years later and they'll write me and say, what was that song we used to sing about blowing in the wind? What was that? Well, you used to do that all the time. And that song really stayed with me. And I would be like doing these kind of protest songs in the classroom. But there was a prescribed curriculum. We talk about the prescribed curriculum. We talk about a hidden curriculum, which says that literature is good, and if you can't read it, you're not good. And if you're having trouble with Shakespeare, it's your problem. That's kind of the hidden curriculum. And then we have the missing curriculum, which is what we never talk about, which is literatures from other cultures, other languages. So that is part of the politics again of this, and politics can sound too extreme. It's part of the social context. It's not just the political part. It is what it is to be social. It is constructed, and the public are investing in the schools, and they're wanting in return a certain level of civilization in their concept, and that's imposed on that has class elements to it, race elements to it. So these things are maybe it's a problem with becoming a professor of education where you're, it's part of your work to think through the full implications. And I would just get
Mm.
inklings of it as a teacher, and then I would have the time to really. I mean, I went and spoke to dictionary editors to find out where the words came from. I started looking at other literary theories that weren't in the schools to see what people thought about the role of imperialism, which really became a turning point for me in terms of my work and on its influence in education.
Yeah. So I guess I'm curious to hear because I feel like the way that I make sense of things in my mind is I feel like a lot of the hard sciences, math, and this is just an oversimplification, but I think it makes it a little easier for me to understand it. But I feel like the hard sciences and math help you understand the world in like ways that are a bit more rigid, while poetry, the humanities, art, paintings can help you understand the things that aren't necessarily so this 2x plus 3 equals this, and it allows for the nuances to exist, for the complexities, for two opposites to exist at the same time, which I think sometimes isn't uh, it doesn't exist in math or in the sciences. And so I feel like they both it took me a long because I grew up in an environment where STEM was hyper valued and I used to not read a single book. I used to think, why would I ever look at a painting? What's the point of poetry? What's the point of any of this? And I was like, no, math and science, everything. And I think as I've gotten older, I have come to understand how important it is, the value of experiencing a painting, truly looking, having that relationship with any piece of art and what it reveals about yourself. And it teaches you things about the world, people. But I feel like from your perspective, having taught English and then seeing, in these last few decades, the kind of shift away from the humanities in some ways, If you were to kind of really iterate or highlight the value of literature, which I think speaks so much more than just literature, it is a particular way of thinking and being, what would you think that is?
I would think it's what I've been representing to you up to this point. That is that ability to both appreciate and be critical and to contextualize, if you like. It is to take responsibility for where this knowledge is and how it is constructed. Um, the humanities starts from a notion of the human, that we are the measure of all things. And that idea can take to the point where this political aspect is it's a human project. There isn't any, and again, it's this, Gotham, your interest in the transcendent. I'm moving beyond to like the truth beyond, is something that the humanities is certainly a part of. But I think we are also critical in the humanities about how much of that is just projection of how where are the lines in this? Where do we draw? And again, religious belief is a very good instance of this. At what point do we say that this is all the work of God or as a metaphysical existence? And at what point do we say this is the human project? And that we are limited and bound in that human project, just as we are in mathematics in terms of its ability to explain the world. Um, and so that there is, for me, in the humanities, that question. And that's perhaps the philosophy, the philosophical side of the humanities versus, as it were, the literary or the aesthetic element and concerned with the transcendent. So it is the humanities is I would say a big church, but that would prejudice it already. It's maybe a big tent. Let's use the circus, but even that's often a church kind of metaphor. So I think that is the aspect. The common thread here is this interest in learning. The common thread is, I hope, that the school is a starting point for learning, but only a starting point. One of the examples I would use is the difference between a library and a school. So if you're a young kid and you're going off after breakfast on your way, and if someone said to you, listen, you've got a choice here. You can go to school as you would normally, but down the road over here is a library. Which would you rather go to and spend your day? And for me, that dream had always been the library. That is the freedom to explore, the whimsical aspect, the discovery under my own control. And so part of my interest in public access to research and scholarship, to return to kind of the central thrust of the latter part of my career, has been to say that we, as educators, need to do more to open the library, to make that path available to knowledge, and to make it open to everyone globally. And so that aspect has been important to me. And I think it's the idealism that you're representing in terms of what can be learned and what can be seen in the humanities or in the sciences or in STEM generally. Um, I'm suggesting has a whole practical apparatus behind it of how you get access to those things. Where do you find out about what's new in a subject? Where do you go when you're not part of a university class or a high school class? Um, and that part of my responsibility as an educator is to say it's not for me to say exactly what you need to learn. It's for me to make sure that as much of that learning is as available as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, because it often feels like learning is centralized through these schooling systems, whether it's higher ed, whether it's just, but the amount of learning that can happen outside, I feel like is also a practice where you have to first start with one thing that you're really curious. I've worked with a few students who I feel like learned from a very young age how to find information that they were curious about and then like learn things that they cared about. And so with or without the kind of structures of school, they were still able to just explore. But that entire thinking process was kind of gained through some sort of school or some sort of teaching. So like the way to think was, and then once they had that tool, they could now go free into the world and learn whatever they wanted. But actually developing the kind of methodology to one, find what you care about, two, find where to go to find information or who to talk to, and then three, remember and connect and all of those things is a practice in a lot of ways. So would you say that like to address you'd have to first start with encouraging or facilitating that desire to learn to begin with?
No, I'm kind of counting on that being innate.
Mm,
I'm saying I need to do the backroom work. I need to make sure the resources are available. I need to make sure that there is public sources of this information. And I also need to address the restrictions on it. The legacy of imperialism around the valuing of the North versus the global South, whether it's literature or science or scholarship. I need to see if we can't do more to create a global exchange of knowledge and to understand the history of that exchange and to see if we can't rectify some of the misrepresentations and injustices in that distribution of access to knowledge and in its production. So excuse me, I'm working in the library, not in the school at this in a way. I'm saying that we have, as someone who works in a university, has worked for a very long time in a university, I have a responsibility to make more of what it has done open and to be critical of how it has gone about producing that information, and who has been involved and who's been represented. And so many people are engaged in that aspect of the representation of knowledge and who participates in that. And I focused in on one aspect just not by chance. I mean, my bookishness meant that I was interested in publishing, and the beauty of books and in the whole, which of course is disappearing, but that aspect of how knowledge is produced was an area that I knew something about and was interested in. And so I've taken that to mean that I have a bit of expertise that I can apply. What can I do to create a better system of production of research and scholarship that
mm,
addresses some of this legacy of particularly of imperialism and colonialism, but also, and that involves languages, involves forms of knowledge, but also the participation, who gets to participate in producing it and who has access to it. And this can be very, very practical. The idea that your doctor doesn't have access to the latest research in relationship to the symptoms you're showing and the condition you have, because
yeah.
there isn't a public basis for that.
I mean, if we were to even talk about research in particular to education, when you were a teacher, what was your relationship to what was the modern, research coming out with? What were the latest findings? Were you reading them
Uh,
as a teacher?
that's amazing you say that. That brings me back. I would be sitting in the staff room at lunch in a public school. I still remember this one time, and there were magazines on the table. I wasn't interested in the conversation, and I picked up and I read this amazing article by Madeline Grumet. And 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, we became friends. She was such a great scholar who was very concerned about the nature of teaching. So I incidentally, and I also would go to the library before I had a degree. I didn't even have my bachelor's degree. I would go to the university, a small, tiny college, in fact, university, a college library in Northern Ontario, and look at journals. So I had this kind of fascination. I dropped out of university, but I really still had a kind of interest. So, and that idea of being able to go to the little college library has been a great inspiration to me. And I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. I understand it's a particular aspect. But I try to be critical of it too. That is, I admire it, but I understand that there's a bit of a whole structure around higher education and who has access to it. So I've tried to address that. I've tried to make the resources of higher education, that is, the research and scholarship behind it, publicly available. And this is this open access movement And today, as a result, not just of me by any means, please, but of many of us concerned that this research was locked away in libraries. You could go to the library, but then you had to pay for parking or find your way to the library. But it was publicly funded research and scholarship. It was about education. I was an education researcher, and I felt that people had a right to, I mean, why couldn't I share that research? Because it was part of a commercial enterprise to publish the research. So my approach
Yeah.
was to work on systems that could alter that, that could create a viable alternative to the commercialization of research and scholarship that locked it up and with very expensive subscriptions in libraries. My library at Stanford allows the public to visit that library 7 times a year. That's all. And so the notion of public access to that material is quite limited. And so I've
Yeah.
devoted my career to putting as much of that research into the public domain. Still has to be paid for, still has to work, we have to work at all of those economic, but it needs to be available globally to every researcher and to every interested member of the public.
Yeah. And so I guess to continue this work forward, I feel like one of the challenges, I have a lot of friends who are amazing psychologists and psychiatrists, and they talk a lot about the kind of public notions of psychology. So the trends that get picked up on multiple personality disorders, like the what ends up getting stuck in the public versus what actually is primarily done in research. And I think the reason that can sometimes happen is research and the way that things are written can sometimes feel so jargony that it's even if a lot of research becomes publicly available, if the way that it's written is still inaccessible, how do
Yes.
we address that?
Okay. So, first of all, because it has not been accessible, there was no demand, no requirement, no expectation that it would be accessible. And so it became scholars talking to scholars in their own private language. So, one theory is it will change if it becomes public. And it will
Hmm.
change because readership changes people. And when you start hearing from the public, you will change how you write. We are as vain, if you like, or human, if you like, as scholars as anyone. And so we've written to impress our other scholars, who are the only ones that have access to it. But if it becomes public, the second aspect of this is that we've learned this over the last couple of decades is that if your family has an illness and you're concerned, you will become an expert in a very short period in the language of that illness.
Yeah.
And you will be able to, after repetition and seeing various articles, be able to master. And jargon will not be an impediment to you getting the proper treatments that you want for your family. So I think those two aspects are there. The podcast, Gotham, I would say, is a good example of bringing this to a public forum. And you'll notice I'm not using jargony language, I hope not too much, in my discussions with you. So I think opening it up will have an impact. And we're just beginning that process since the turn of the century, and allowing and trusting people to find their way. They will not become experts in everything. But if they have a passion about astronomy or a passion about family illness, it will not be an impediment.
Hmm. In that case, what are your feelings on like places like Wikipedia, which I feel like are phenomenal kind of
So
resources?
that no, they totally. Wikipedia is part of what I'm talking about. The public, they've done more for public access to knowledge than any other organization. I am among, when it first started, I said this will not happen. There is no incentive for people to contribute. There's no glory. You're practically anonymous in this kind of cryptic identification as an editor. And I was dead wrong. And people, so I think it's very much, but it is, again, it is a gateway. It doesn't have the depth. It too struggles with access to scholarship. So I feel that to help Wikipedia, we need to make sure that everything a Wikipedian, an editor, wants to read is publicly available and that the links are there. So the Wikipedia is a gateway. I don't want to say a gateway drug, but a gateway or getting into the depth, going deep and gaining that expertise that we just talked about in terms of handling the language, the specifics of the language and the terms and approaches. So Wikipedia is part of this public access, and it has made a huge, huge difference in terms of people's approach to knowledge.
Yeah. I I'm also really curious. This is just my person. I'm just curious to hear what you think about this because as you were talking about the publicly available, the two notes that I wrote down is one, the what we just talked about, the ability to understand the jargon, which I think the example that you gave of the jargon itself changing as it becomes public is an awesome point. And the other one that I think this is one that is personally very relevant to me and it just plays out in a lot of ways, but it really is the desire to learn. So the example that you gave is when a health condition arises. I think that can be said for learning about the engine of a car. When your car breaks down, you have to learn it. But I think there's a lot of things that quantum physics, for example, is something that like most often in your day to day probably will not arise to where like there's a deep desire to go learn it. And I think there's the world of like the highly abstracted usually never actually comes into play in your day to day, but they do have a lot of really big implications on all types of things. So I guess my other question is, how do you cultivate an environment where the desire for knowledge kind of unless it's okay for it to only exist in some places. But I feel like the opening of knowledge in all dimensions is very important. But would you maybe say that if people were just to naturally not care about one thing, it's okay for that field to kind of just slowly die out, maybe?
Now, I think we do need to rely on people's enthusiasm and interests. And part of it for me is to not prejudge, to not say this is what we need to develop in terms of knowledge, but to create the
Mm,
platforms, to create the ability to share. So we do work on developing the technical platforms for publishing journals and to facilitate the use of that journal publishing platform. So it can share knowledge around the world. It can be indexed. It can be peer reviewed. It can um, be cited. And so without just saying what, like, do we rule on whether there are journals about, the white supremacy that's promoting white supremacy? No, we just build the platform in that regard. I would certainly object strenuously to such a journal, but the platform principle is an important aspect. And then we also are responsible for making sure that it can be found, that it can be indexed, that it can circulate globally. So though that's been the kind of level, and I'm trusting the enthusiasm of others. But let me give you a school example. A good friend of mine, the late Kieran Egan, had a theory of schooling where you would take one topic as a child in your second or third grade, and you would pursue that for your whole elementary education. And you would learn as much about apples as could possibly be learnt, or about quantum physics, or about, and so this was learning in depth because we don't get enough of that in the schools. We go, an hour of science and an hour of literature, followed by an hour of a second language. And he felt that we needed to give students the experience of depth. And so they would, by the time they got to grade 8, they would know as much about a topic as anyone. Um, and learning in depth was a theory of education that a few schools have taken up, but it's an idea of how the schools can be more responsive, can take their educational responsibilities not to the extreme, but to develop and refine in a way that allows a child to explore those interests, as you mentioned, to a much, much greater degree and spark an enthusiasm compared to, oh, it's 3 o'clock, it's time for science.
yeah, I mean, I think 100%. And I feel like it's only once you develop the ability, and I think that's kind of the power of a PhD or higher ed in general, when you learn to kind of dive deep into one thing, you learn the kind of structure of what it takes to do that. And then you could then go and move that into any kind of other field, starting with the very basics and then slowly build your expertise to go deep into it because you've learned to do that once. That's actually something I find to be really special about a lot of high school kids who are athletes because I feel like they do that, especially if they very much care about the sport that they're playing. They've done that already one time in their sport, where I think a lot of people who might be really quote unquote smart don't necessarily have to go deep into anything so long as they're able to like maintain their high grade. So I actually
Yes.
find this to be really special and common among athletes.
Hmm, that's very interesting. Yes, because they perform at a professional level virtually, and whereas we don't do that in any subject area. So yeah, that's good. Good
Yeah.
point. Did you
And
have a
so
sport when
no,
as
so
a,
I only learned to go deep in college when I was learning classical Indian music, and the teacher that I had gone to was, I mean, just truly an amazing human being. But I think he taught me so many things about what it means to truly fall in love with the craft and the art itself of it, and how to go extremely deep into constantly trying to be to not just be better, but why are you to like reflect on your intentions. It was just such a the whole
oh,
process itself was so amazing, and I feel like
nice?
after that, I realized, oh my, you can do this with anything. I can take anything and really fall in love with it if I can apply this mindset to that as well. And I just I didn't even know how to do that for most of my life until then. And so
Hmm.
I think, yeah, because the joy that comes from not only falling in love, but feeling like yourself growing and improving and seeing the results, I mean, it's so rewarding. Do you feel like what's the last thing you feel like you did where you really went most recently?
Well, I do have a band, as I mentioned, and so I play guitar, and I take that very seriously. And it's interesting. I haven't had an instructor like you've had. I think that would be very inspiring. But I have bandmates who have very high expectations. And I take a great deal of pleasure of both the practicing and the sharing. Um, and so I think one of the retirement benefits is that you gain an extra half hour of practice or so a day. You have the time. So I think that for me has been a part of it. Um, I think the work with the Public Knowledge Project has been similarly interesting and rewarding. We every day discover new areas and journals that are. We have 58,000 journals around the world using our platform, and the topics in a range of are amazing. So I'll be looking at research, and I'll scroll to the bottom of the page, and it'll be sure enough, it's our platform they're using to share their knowledge. So we're committed to making this possible, and we have the pleasure of seeing others take it up. And I think in music,
Mm,
there's the same thing where you work very hard, but the moment when somebody else appreciates it is a very important aspect of kind of realizing what you've done.
yeah. And as you were talking, something really came up to mind, which I was thinking about Google for some reason. And I was thinking about how when you search something on Google, you're presented with, 100,000 options, right? I don't think I've ever gone past page two or three. So even in this example where you have this extremely open, uh, to some extent, you can find all this information. Google then has the power to show you what's one, two, three, four, five. And so they kind of direct your attention in a very serious way. And it's not necessarily clear that their ranking system truly does show you the most accurate, or it's just the most clicked with the most sites, whatever their metric is. But their metric kind of becomes the God then, because that's what channels all information towards you. So even in an extremely open system, I guess the question then becomes, how does a person discern what's worth reading?
Yes, I think you need to stop, if I can be so blunt with you, the idea that there's going to be an ideal, there's going to be a purity in any
Mm,
search engine or any practice, walking into a bookstore or going to the library.
mm,
Um, and so there is the structures behind it. And I talked about, the legacy of imperialism has a huge influence on our knowledge systems. But within that, we still have some control and some element. So Google now gives you the AI summary. on every search and an introduction, but you can skip that. Or you can learn lightly from it and then go your own way. So I think you're not going to escape that. I think that's the first thing, and need to accept it. And Google's way of how Google established itself so successfully was to use the page rankings. That is, everyone was kind of voting on what should be at the top. Now they have advertising, but they're pretty clear about that. I have a son who works at Google, so I have to confess here I have a conflict of interest I should be upfront about because I'm clearly supportive. Um, we work with Google Scholar. Let me just jump over for a parallel here. So Google Scholar is a dedicated part of Google that works specifically on scholarship and research. And since 2004, they reached out to us. And in fact, our group was even resistant. The project is ours was a university-based nonprofit, and we said, oh, no, we don't deal with this commercial entity. Um, and then we realized that we were cutting off I mean, there was a power to Google that we couldn't resist. We couldn't be so pure in our efforts that there would be a kind of secretive or commercial aspect. But Google Scholar has stayed commercial free. It does a wonderful job of representing the variety of languages. We have found 60 languages are being used for publishing research using our platform. And we spoke to Google about it, and they welcomed. It was in fact amazing in the sense that we shared our list with them. And Anna Regatura is the senior engineer there, and he's first of all he pointed out two languages we had missed in our own data that were being used, and he welcomed four more languages into Google Scholar that he would start considering as resources of research. So these systems are prejudiced, if you like, by the larger commercial entity and being part of capitalism and all of those aspects. And within them, there are points to appreciate, points of opportunity for sharing that didn't exist previously. And so there's a level of compromise, if you like, in terms of your earlier point, Gutham, and there is a chance to see within it what can still be valuable and remarkable in terms of having that access that is free. So we see ourselves with Google Scholar as a good example of how this partnering with a commercial entity to increase global access to research and scholarship.
Hmm. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I guess the piece that I'm touching on is because I feel like I've heard people say things like, there's so much news available that it's like it can sometimes be overwhelming to where you don't
Yes.
actually know where or who to turn to because there are so many different sources that are saying pretty much quite literally the opposite things based on the same situation. And if you were to bring in politics, if you take what happened in Minnesota, like you can go to two different sources that say the complete opposite. So it becomes, I think, in the modern day, it's much more challenging to actually know what to read and what to pay attention to. And I
Of
feel
course.
like as you open up information, now the before it was like, okay, whatever shows up on the news, there's one or two. I listen to, there's only so many sources I need to turn to, whatever they're saying I listen to. But
Mhm.
now you have a different challenge where now information is far more open, but the challenge becomes who do you trust and what do you pay attention to? So what about that?
It's an age of misinformation. I mean, let's just be candid about it, okay? And I totally accept that. In fact, I use it as part of an inspiration. So the reason we need public access to research is because it's an age of misinformation. And research, it has reasons to it. I mean, research takes a great deal of care around its integrity and around its quality. So I want research to be one of the options. I don't have a general answer to the question, how do you wade through all of this work? I'm only going to say that my responsibility is to make sure that one of the things that's available is research. And we're actually working on what we're calling a publication facts label. On food, there's a nutrition facts that warns you
Yeah.
about the number of calories, the sugar, and the sodium. So we've created a version of that for research that says how many peer reviewers are there? How many days did it take to decide this article was worth publishing? Are there
Mm.
conflicts of interest with the authors? Who funded this work? Is the data available? And a little label looks just like the nutrition facts label because we think that we haven't done enough as researchers to prepare the public to see that,
Mm,
to recognize what is research. How do I know when it's research? Just as you say, how do I know this is good food? How do I know there's no arsenic in this food? So, which was the start of the whole movement to put the nutrition facts in the 70s and 80s, the 1970s and 80s, when the movement arose from the public saying we have a right to know when it comes to food. And I'm working with the Public Knowledge Project now on this publication facts label to say the public has a right to know, is this peer-reviewed research? Do the authors have a conflict of interest with the sugar industry or the American Tobacco Federation or whatever? So I think it isn't, the age of misinformation is a challenge. The distraction, the misrepresentation, all of these different things for sure. And all I'm trying to do is say that we as researchers and scholars, in fact, not even we, just a few of us within research and scholarship have said we're taking seriously our responsibilities to the public. And we're going to try to make sure the research is available to them. And we're going to try to put on a small label, a guide to whether this is research and why. Doesn't mean that they didn't manipulate the data. It doesn't mean that their science is completely guaranteed forever. But it does mean that there is a difference between a
yeah.
Wikipedia article, between an X tweet, and between a research publication.
Yeah. Do you also look into the kind of culture that exists around publications and that whole kind of arena?
The prestige publications, what it means, and the costs and the economy. So, yes, we look into the economics. We look into how you need to publish or perish in very good journals, so the prestige question. Part of the label is to build greater trust on a global basis. Part of the
Mm,
prestige culture means you only publish in a very few journals or you don't get tenure and promoted. And we think there's a lot of research being wasted because people are so drawn to the prestige of a very small number of journals. So, yes, so
yeah.
the economics and the politics, the status elements are all part of this work that we do. And it's not even a field in the academy. Like there is English and there is science and math you talked about. There isn't a field of the study of scholarly communication or the field of scholarly publishing. So I only did it
Mm,
after I got tenure as a professor of education because I wouldn't have got tenure. And once I had that security, I was able to turn away from how do I make better teachers, as it were? How do I help in the classroom to say, wait a second, how do I help make sure that those teachers have access to research about the classroom?
yeah. I guess I hear what I'm hearing you say a lot of is and what I'm hearing is like a lot of the work that you're sharing, I feel like carries with it a particular ethos and relationship to knowledge as a whole. And I feel like I wonder if we could find what that is. I feel like then we can maybe contrast that with what we might feel like exists right now. And then maybe, what would you say you could kind of maybe identify what that ethos would
Uh,
be?
well, so this is an ethos that of knowledge writ large, of which I'm talking only about research and scholarship, the work of the universities. So it's not all knowledge. Wikipedia does a better job of all knowledge. And I'm saying that we have created these institutions, these very old, going back to medieval periods, to the year 1200, these old institutions dedicated to this kind of knowledge. It's not the whole of it. Your grandparents, my grandparents had a wisdom that isn't part of the university system. And so it is a very particular responsibility I've taken on. And I wouldn't want to misrepresent it as the most important knowledge or the overarching, but I think it is something that has value. And I've dedicated my life to it. And so it's a particular value for a certain kind of knowledge. The peer review process, for example, that anonymous reviewers will look at your work and criticize it before it's published. So it goes through something different. And in these days of TikTok and other forms of social media, Well, actually, it's an interesting comparison with TikTok because there's peer review in TikTok. Thousands of people vote on each piece, and their peers. For sure, they produce TikTok videos themselves. But there's still a difference. That happens in a flash, and research does not happen in a flash. And there are standards within research that I think are worth defending. So it isn't. I don't want to make universal claims or absolute claims about this is the only kind or the best kind. There are terrible failures in research, scandals, and many of the things that have improved research have been scandals. We didn't used to say where our funding came from until the tobacco industry corrupted the research on cancer and smoking. And then all of a sudden
Mm,
it became very important. You'd better declare if you have where your research funding comes from and if you have competing interests. So it's not to say that science is the perfect form of knowledge and the rest of the world is awash in ignorance. No, it's a human enterprise that I feel some responsibility towards since I've made my living and enjoyed very much being a part of it. And I'm trying to, as it were, improve it, as particularly as a public good.
yeah.
And
Do,
that modest goal is what I'm after. Go ahead.
what forces do you feel like you're working against? Like, do you feel like there are institutions, agencies, or people, or even that you feel like you're fighting against?
I want to be careful about this. I don't want to reflect any kind of serious paranoia here, but the commercialization of scholarly publishing by very big corporations only began. In fact, it's the span of my life in the 1950s. It before that it was simply much more an amateur and scholarly society enterprise. So that commercialization, and I don't see them as enemies so much as a challenge around how do we create a system that will finance itself. You can't publish for free. It isn't a business, if you like. So how do we create financial models and how do we create platforms and technologies that will change the commercialization to remove it from the extent to which it is a profit generating corporate shareholder value production, which has made access to research very difficult. And it's now gone. It's interesting that when your dreams come true, Gotham, my dream in 2000 was open access to research. And the publisher said, you'll kill science. If you create free access, there will be no
Mm,
publishing and it will be the end of science. Now, 25 years later, 26 years later, the the publishers, the commercial publishers say open access is the best thing for science. They've recognized, especially after the pandemic, that open science improves science, but they've commercialized that openness. Authors can pay $10,000 to $20,000 for one article to be made open from their research grants. And so they've taken the profit margin from the subscription price of $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 to subscribe to a journal to the author fee to make it open of 3 to 5 to 10 to even $20,000. So that commercialization limits who can participate in science.
mm,
And that's what I'm trying, and the people in the Public Knowledge Project are trying, and people all over the world in different projects are trying to create a viable alternative, a non-commercial way of sharing and publishing high quality research.
yeah. I, I kind of feel this with the podcast, and I feel this with Wikipedia, Khan Academy. Like Wikipedia runs primarily on donations. Khan Academy also runs primarily on donations, and I feel like that's in some ways, if I don't want to say only way, but it feels like some of the best podcasters I know run primarily through donations on Patreon. Like it seems to be the only way, but that means you have to then not build, but you have to cultivate a culture where people would, even if you were to offer a free service, when they gain so much value, they want to support, they want to kind of give back rather than being like, it's free. Like, I mean, I'm not, why do I want to pay for it? Right. So that's why I feel like there's also a much larger cultural revolution that needs to happen around how we relate
Mhm.
to these services, you know?
Yes, yeah, and that takes time. These institutions of the universities, as I said, date back to the 12th century and have a huge history. But only since the 1950s has there been a commercialization of this aspect. So you're born digital in the podcast world. You don't have that cultural, you haven't had that capture, that the commercial capture, although there are commercial aspects of podcasting too, of course. So I think that we are constantly reinventing ourselves and finding alternative ways. And Patreon is a very good example of how that has sprung up and created an alternative economy. And so I think I'd want to say that we did a similar thing. We created an open source software platform. We've gotten the support of governments. We've gotten the support of libraries who want to see a non-commercial version. And we don't know what the future is going to bring, but we've been able to build to this point this viable alternative. And that, to me, is an important aspect. It's not the majority, but it is certainly at 58,000 journals, a substantial number and a substantial alternative.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I guess as we wrap this conversation up, when you think about people continuing forward your work, what would you like to see maybe in the next 50 or 25 years?
Right now, Gutham, that's a good question. And you're going to grant my wish? Is that, am I clear on
that? Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so in that case, for 25 years, I've been doing 28 years or so, 29 years, I've been doing this. We've got, and again, it's not just me by any means, we're reached about the 50% point. About 50% of the research and scholarship published this year, 2026, will be freely available to the public and to scholars all over the world, okay? 50%. If
Wow.
you were to grant me the other 50%, and it became the standard that all research, because it's research and scholarship, it's public. It's in the public good. It's in the public interest, and it's a public good. So if you, I don't want 30 years, if that's what you're saying. I know you said that. I have to allow you your own speed. But if you could grant me that wish, and we got to 100% or 98%, yes, I will write you in an old-fashioned letter with a stamp on it, a very warm and sincere thank you note.
Okay. I mean, I would love to see that. Yeah, I feel like a world where knowledge is something we all equally partake in. And I think a lot of the things that you said earlier about the cultures of imperialism just influencing who has access to knowledge, what types of knowledge, and what knowledge gets chosen to be pushed forward is something to also always keep in mind and take consideration of. And so I had an amazing time talking to you. Thank you so much for all your time and joining us on the show today.
It was a great pleasure, Bill. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you all for listening. Season 12 has been amazing. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And as per usual, stay re-educated.